Well, this is going to be a brief video lecture. I will expect that by the time you are looking at the study aids and watching this lecture, you have already watched the short film, 5 or 6 minutes, I believe, which introduces you to the context, the circumstances in which King's letter was written, to whom it was addressed. It was addressed initially to a group of clergymen who had published a letter in the newspaper saying, please, you might want to just tone this down. You might want to wait. Maybe this isn't the best timing. And this nonviolent non-cooperation, nonviolent resistance may be too extreme. Well, okay. A few things I want to note. First of all, this is in many ways a living application of themes that were introduced to us and in this course in the Euthyphro and the Crito. First of all, King, I want to point out, King was a Baptist minister. He was able to actually get people out into the streets and get them to do things because he was very persuasive as an orator. Okay, now, of course, as Plato points out in Book 1 of the Republic, having a great skill doesn't make you a great man. Having a great skill means that you have the potential to be a great man, but you could also use the same skill for evil. I always when I see film footage of Adolf Hitler, so persuasive to those enthusiastic crowds of Germans, and more recently, people who are able to whip up great crowds of people. I always have to think, what if they were making that emotional appeal? What if they were able to motivate people in this way, but they were doing it for equality, for fairness, for justice, for benevolence, for compassion? Wouldn't that be a wonderful thing? Of course, it may be easier, simply, given our biology, to whip us up into a frenzy with hatred than with what Christians call love, and what various philosophers might call love. And by love, we don't mean sort of romantic feelings, but rather an attitude of benevolence. We will. Later in the course, we will talk about the topic of love. I have a video lecture on the concept of love. In Western culture, it is, in contemporary English particularly, the term love is so ambiguous. It can mean 101 different things. You love pizza. You love, your favorite band. You love God. You love your significant other, you love your children, you love your cat. What exactly does it mean? Well, it probably doesn't mean the same thing in every instance. But King is using love in the sense that it's traditionally used in Christian ethics, which is, I'm not a Christian myself, so I'm not proselytizing when I tell you this, but it's important to understand. Ethics, says King in this letter, is love embodied. Well, what do we mean by love? We don't mean that we look at other human beings and go, oh, I love you. No, we look at other human beings and say, you have moral worth. Even if you're not behaving well at the moment, you have moral worth and you deserve respect and empathy. When I say I love you, I'm committing myself to how I'm going to treat you. If I say I like you, then I'm predicting how I think you're going to make me feel. It's not the same. Okay. I met a woman once. She was dropping off her kids at school at the same time I was dropping off my son at school, and she was having a little tiff with her son. And she looked at me and she said, as he walked away, and said, I love him, but right now I sure don't like him. All right, well, I thought, one, I don't I don't have that kind of feelings toward my son. I mean, I am very fortunate. I like him a great deal, as well as loving him. But but I understand how you feel. You can think that you have a moral obligation to be benevolent towards someone, and you can emotionally really care about that person, care about the person's well-being, without necessarily approving of how that person is acting, without liking how the person is acting. Well, that's all relevant here because essentially King is bringing that ethos into the situation of the civil rights struggle and saying, we must love even those who do wrong to us. We must respect that they are human, and we must not begin to demonize them. As soon as we demonize them, basically we're going to turn into what we say they are, and that will be a moral defeat. He's following the example of Mahatma Gandhi in India, who chastised his followers. You must demonstrate that you are morally worthy of independence, that you can conduct yourself in a humane and just and civilized way. Otherwise, why are you demanding independence? Show you can govern yourself, and then while you are demanding that you be allowed to govern yourself. So, like Socrates, King thinks that his highest duty is his duty to his conscience and to his God, as he understands his God. And of course, this notion of Christian love is the chief lens through which he interprets the will of God. Now, remember the Euthyphro problem. Okay, people can have all kinds of different ideas about what the will of God is or what their religious duties are. Looking at the Euthyphro dilemma, does God love X because X is already good, or does X become good because God loves it? Okay, that all becomes, again, vital, not just abstract, but vital, because King is not saying we must follow some sort of dogma, we must follow unquestioningly some particular teaching. He is saying rather we must cultivate a certain benevolent attitude. Confucius taught that for civilization to be possible, respect and empathy were necessary. I have to have empathy. I have to realize that you are a being who has an emotional life. You have your own aspirations. You have your own fears, your own joy, your own suffering, and I must respect that. Fully comprehending that you are a full-fledged being, I must then respect that fact and act as if it matters. To the degree to which that is done, we can have civilization. To the degree to which that's not done, civilization will crumble and turn into simply a war of everybody against everybody else. Well, King is embracing a similar ethic. We must, Gandhi is often quoted as saying, be the change you want to see in the world. Actually, he never said those exact words, and that's an interpretation of many things that Gandhi did say, however, and it's not a bad summation of at least parts of his thoughts. King, again, is saying embodied ethics, embodied love, embodied benevolence, embodied compassion is the foundation of our ethics. So you see, this is not, going back to the Euthyphro dilemma, this is not saying, I have to do this, I have to keep the races separate, I have to do this and that and so forth, without questioning why, because God commanded it. It's not like, no, what I have to do is to learn to love my fellow human beings and then act out of that. And if I believe that God is love and I believe that God is benevolent, God is just and fair, then I am going to interpret my own actions as following or not following the will of God based on whether they are in fact motivated by love. Okay. After King, we're going to pretty much move to secular ethics, but Understand how important it is for most people, their religious upbringing, what they embrace or reject about the religion of their culture, plays such a vital role in their conception of what's right and wrong, what their moral duties are, what their moral duties are not. That we needed to give it straight off, needed to give it a close examination, a clear-eyed examination. So, St. Augustine, King quotes St. Augustine. I've mentioned him before in terms of, you remember the theory of just wars, and I mentioned Augustine's incredible importance for the formation of modern European Christianity, particularly of the church. Well, not so simply modern, but of mainstream Christianity as it has flowered. Augustine said a law that is not just is not a law at all. And that just hits it on the nail, doesn't it? As far as a lot of the things that we've looked at concerning with Socrates and the Crito, when do you have a duty to obey? When do you have no duty to obey? And when do you actually have a duty to defy? An unjust law is not a law at all. Well, now here's a problem. Okay. Two different people may think something is just or unjust. Remember in Weston's book, he talked about the situation where blacks and whites couldn't sit together at the same lunch counter. The white segregationists felt it was completely unjust, completely unfair that they should have to sit at the same lunch counter as blacks if they didn't want to. The owner of the lunch counter could have said, you know, it's really not fair to me, it's unjust to me, this is my own property to tell me who I must serve and who I must not serve. And you listen to some of the most vocal opponents of the civil rights movement. Many of them do not ever, or at least rarely, say that blacks are inferior, blacks are evil, blacks are not entitled to be treated justly. What they say is, you can't make me. I don't have to associate with anybody I don't want to associate with. It is tyranny to tell me that I cannot discriminate. That's kind of pretzel logic, isn't it? Right? If I'm essentially denying equality, due process under law, equal social access to public places to a certain group of people when everybody else has that access. What I'm trying to do is essentially to oppress. I mean, dress it up any way you like. A co-worker of mine once was arguing about gay rights, and she was very much opposed to gay rights, and she belonged to some conservative church in the Hartford area, I believe. And she was going on and on, and two other co-workers were telling her, you know what, leave people alone. It's none of your business. What does it hurt? Well, it's unnatural and it's against God's will and so forth. I said, hey, you know what? If it were like utterly unnatural, nobody would do it. It's got to be within the scope of things that happen in nature. And how do you know it's not God's will? We're supposed to love each other. Two people love each other. What's that to you? Well, I had to get from one room to another, and I had to, there was no way I could do ninja invisibility things and get by without being seen. But I tried to slither by because I didn't want to get involved in that situation. I was at work, and I had things to do. But the woman who was ranting about gays whirled around and said to me, "What do you think?" And I said, "Don't ask me what I think unless you really want to hear what I think." And she said, "Yeah, what do you think? I want to know. What do you think about this?" And I said, "What I actually think is that you want to deny basic human rights and equality under law to 10% of the human race, and you want to do it based upon Bronze Age superstitions." Excuse me. I left. The other two women were laughing their heads off. The woman I was just to whom I said that was looking like, what language are you speaking? Okay, but I invoke that here simply because, yeah, you're talking about, you're saying you have a divine command to deny equality under law, and in many cases, basic human rights to a certain group of people. Why? Because some ancient text tells you to. You might as well say the voices in your head told you to. The whole Euthyphro thing gets involved here. How do you justify discrimination if you're not just simply straight up saying, I belong to a privileged class and I'm trying to defend and promote that privilege? In which case, you've taken it totally out of the realm of ethics. You're now simply in the area of self-promotion. But unless you're going to say that, you pretty much have to say, yeah, I think that I have a divine command to be, fairly, say, nasty to a minority, because that minority traditionally is not approved of. Okay, most of the gay people I know just, would, at this point, would laugh at that and say, approved of? Who asked you? Okay, well, okay. Here's something I want you to think about. The social contract. If the social contract is a just agreement, then we have an obligation to follow it, all things being equal. Okay? We discussed that at length when we talked about the Crito. Even if it's a just agreement, it seems to be the position of Socrates that there may be some instances where fulfilling that just agreement would come into conflict with other important moral principles, in which case you have to make a judgment call. Okay? He says, look, I have great respect for the law. So does Dr. King. He says, it's no small matter to break the law. We bring down anarchy upon ourselves, and it's going to be hell to pay for everybody. So what we want to do is to, in as orderly a manner as possible, not simply overturn rule by law, but target specific laws and say, echoing Augustine, if this law is unjust, it's not legitimately a law at all. Of course, and as I was saying, if two people disagree about that, what do? We have to have some way of arbitrating it. That's where the whole constructive dialogue business comes in. Okay, and there are a number of places throughout the letter where essentially King is endorsing, one, the idea of constructive dialogue. We should negotiate in good faith whenever possible. And two, exactly what Singer talked about, and when we talked about the limits of constructive dialogue. If people are not willing to negotiate in good faith, or if they are not making a good faith effort to keep that negotiation, that's a whole different ballgame, in which case you may, in fact, be morally justified in ignoring the law, or even morally compelled to defy the law if it is causing demonstrable harm to follow it. All right. One of the problems in a complex society of millions of people and a hierarchy of laws. We have local laws, we have state laws, we have national laws. So saying the law is just, the law is unjust, you have to be way more specific than that. Okay, King believed, and history has shown him to be correct, at least for the period he was living in, almost half a century ago. Good Lord, time does fly. King believed that the highest law of the land is the Constitution, which is correct. Legally, that is technically correct. The Constitution is the highest law of the land. State and local laws may not violate the Constitution, insofar as the Constitution guarantees due process and certain basic rights to every American citizen. State and local laws are not empowered to overturn those rights. Okay? It's not that the local laws don't have authority. It's their authority is not as great as the authority of state laws, and it's not that the state laws don't have authority, but their authority is not as great as constitutional law. Well, national law has to meet the standard of not violating the Constitution. That's one of the things that the Supreme Court decides when there are controversial cases. Is the state, or is the state law or the local law somehow violating the rights of American citizens by ignoring the Constitution or contradicting the Constitution? If so, the law was not legitimate to begin with. King believes that if he violates the law, there will be test cases. If the test cases are fought all the way to the Supreme Court will uphold the Constitution, and change will be brought about in an orderly, legally and in an orderly way. Okay. Now, that of course depends upon who's currently sitting on the Supreme Court, whether they do have a commitment to real fairness and a commitment to defending the Constitution. Okay. So, two ideas that King brings up that I do want to mention. Well, one idea that he brings up and another that I want to add. He speaks about Martin Buber. This is in your study aids. Martin Buber, B-U-B-E-R, who was an important 20th century Hebrew philosopher. Buber talked about what he called the I-thou relationship. I-thou. I relate to you as a thou, not as an it, not as an object, not in terms of some social or traditional stereotype I have about you. But I think this is very much in harmony with the Confucian precept that I should treat you with empathy and respect. You are a thou. As Immanuel Kant, who we will study a little later, as Immanuel Kant would say, you are a moral agent, you have moral worth, intrinsic moral worth. Every human being is an end in himself or herself. Persons are an end in themselves. Okay, so if I treat you in a way that acknowledges your intrinsic moral worth, that has empathy and respect, that is an I-thou relationship. When I deprive you of that kind of consideration, when I regard you as an it, that divorces me from any kind of meaningful moral dialogue with you. Okay? Now, I also want to add, I'll let you see the reference. That basically, if I look at a black man and I see a stereotype, that's an I-it. If I look at a woman and I see a stereotype, that is a I-it. If I look at anyone else who is a moral agent and treat them as a stereotype, that is an I-it. I do not acknowledge their thou-ness. Okay. So, I also want to mention, this is in your study aids again, something called the veil of ignorance. Okay, this was introduced by John Rawls. John Rawls, I'll mention several times during the course, wrote a work in the 20th century called A Theory of Justice, which is very influential, very important. His notion of the veil of ignorance is very much in the same ballpark as Crito's, Crito's no arbitrary exceptions principle. Okay, by Crito I mean the Crito, not the person Crito. Okay, act in a way you're willing to universalize with no arbitrary exceptions. If you advocate, what the veil of justice says is that if you or veil of ignorance rather, says is that if you advocate that any particular state of affairs or policy or whatever is just, is fair, is acceptable even, you have to do so without reference to where you would fall in that scheme of things. In other words, if I want to advocate that slavery, for instance, often used example here, if I were to advocate that slavery is morally acceptable, I would have to make that argument irrespective of whether I would end up being the slave or the master. If I want to argue that certain crimes deserve the death penalty, I have to argue that irrespective of whether I would be the one being executed or whether some loved one would be the one being executed. If I argue for racial discrimination or any other kind of privilege, I have to do that irrespective of whether I would belong to the privileged class or the disadvantaged class. Okay? Am I really arguing about fairness? Am I really universalizing? Am I really avoiding arbitrary exceptions, particularly from arbitrary exceptions for yourself, which is the most common form of making an arbitrary exception? That is, as Socrates says in the Crito, I can't make an arbitrary exception for myself. Presumably, he could make an arbitrary exception if one of his friends was in jail. So, anyone arguing for the separation of races and for the inequality of social status would have to say, this is just, even if I were to belong to the oppressed class. A stand-up comedian, I don't recall the person's name, not someone whose work I'm very familiar with, made a quip during one of his routines, this is a few years ago. He said, it's been predicted that by, when we get to mid-century in the 21st century, that white people in the United States will no longer be the majority. Non-whites collectively, Black, Latino, Asian American, so forth and so forth, will actually be the majority. He said, now, a lot of white people are worried about that. Why would you be worried? Didn't you treat minorities well when you were in the majority? Okay, well, the irony, the humor, the irony makes the point. People should be treated fairly whether you belong to the majority class or not. To say that minorities may be treated unfairly, are you willing to maintain that even if you become the minority? Probably not. Okay. Reference is made, paragraph 29, to the Nation of Islam or the Black Muslim movement. I'd note in your study aids, because you may not be familiar with this, this is an American religious and political movement that regarded Christianity as the religion of white colonialism. The indigenous religions, particularly Islam, practiced by Black Africans who were enslaved, was stolen from them along with important other parts of their identity, and the religion of the oppressor, Christianity, was instead substituted. King, of course, would say that's a perversion of Christianity. I mean, you look at what Jesus actually taught about about being just and benevolent to those who are oppressed, and it's hard to sustain an ethical argument for the slave owner ethos. You have to really go cherry picking to make a moral case for slavery from the teachings of Jesus. Okay, but okay, Christianity was certainly used to try to keep oppressed African Americans in their place. It's a great historical inversion that King is now using it to try to liberate African Americans. Well, yeah, Black power, appreciation of African roots, Black nationalism, Black pride. These are all important elements emphasized by the Black Muslim Church, or the Black Muslim movement, or the members of the Nation of Islam rejected nonviolence and, in fact, armed themselves to prepare for a violent struggle, which they believed was inevitable. Okay. Interestingly, Malcolm X, one of the most well-known and respected leaders of the Black Muslim movement, broke with his mentor, Elijah Muhammad, over the question of race, not over the question of whether we should prepare for a violent struggle, because he believed that was inevitable. White America was going to make that necessary. We were going to start shooting. In fact, we were shooting, if you take a look at what was going on in various places at the time, not just in the South, but you look at where the privilege was really seriously being challenged, you'll find official gunfire, shall we say. Good thing we're past that, huh? I mean, yes, I'm being ironic. Well, Elijah Muhammad, or rather Malcolm X, went to Mecca for his pilgrimage, which is one of the duties of Muslims, that at least once in your lifetime, if you're a Muslim, if you can do it, you're in good enough health and you can afford to do it, you are supposed to go to Mecca, okay, on a sacred pilgrimage as a way of strengthening your faith. Malcolm X returned from his pilgrimage to Mecca saying, I saw good Muslims from Scandinavian countries. I saw blonde-haired, blue-eyed Muslims. I saw Muslims of every conceivable color. I saw Muslims that, from every country all around the world. I no longer believe in the Nation of Islam's tenet that the white man is the devil. People who act like the devil are the devil. And I am now convinced that, through my own experience, that you must judge people by their conduct, not simply by the color of their skin. Gee, he came around to one of Martin Luther King's most famous tenets. Okay. George Wallace is mentioned in paragraph 40. George Wallace was an outspoken opponent of the civil rights movement, ran as a third-party candidate for president, was a lightning rod for the anger, the pushback against the civil rights movement. Famously, physically stood at the entryway to a school that was to be integrated to try to prevent black students from entering, was physically removed by the National Guard. The National Guard had been sent by President Kennedy to make sure that those black students were actually able to enter the school. Okay, so Wallace is the one who advocated famously segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. It's interesting to mention that in his later years, as an old man, he totally repented of his racism. Yes, miracles do happen sometimes. He spent the last years of his life personally apologizing to the people he felt he had hurt. He said, I was wrong. Just flat out, I was wrong. I was the enemy of good men. I was the friend of men who were doing evil. I did the devil's work on earth. I was wrong. Well, that seems like a good point at which to end this lecture. King's goal is always to get people to the table to negotiate in good faith. to show them that there is really no option but to do so. And always his methods were supposed to be nonviolent, like Socrates. Socrates practiced civil disobedience when he thought that the law was wrong. Famously, as I've mentioned before, he refused to cooperate with when there was a coup. He taking over the government of Athens. He refused to cooperate, particularly when they ordered him to do things that he felt were unjust or illegal under the legitimate laws of Athens. He could have been put to death for that. Nobody ever got around to it, and the coup did not last long enough for him to actually suffer the ultimate consequences for that. But he was practicing nonviolent non-cooperation. I have no duty to obey these laws. And if you try to force me to do something unjust, if you order me to do something unjust, I have a moral duty to defy those laws. So it's no wonder that King names Socrates as one of the originators, or one of the first historical examples of the use of nonviolent non-cooperation as a means for social change.